misleading, as we'll see. I didn't know when I came here who invented them. And I now know, I've been informed by the man who just sang for us, that it was Bishop Miletus in the 2nd century who gave titles to the two parts of our Bible. And really they are very misleading. I'm going to ask two questions. How many covenants are there in the Bible, and how many still apply to Christians out of them all? And to give you the answer right at the beginning, there are 5 covenants in the Bible, 4 of which affect Christians. 1 doesn't. And of those 5 covenants, 1 is called Old Covenant, and 1 is called New. And the rest goes straight through, from Jews to Christians. Indeed, even more surprising, all 5 covenants are to be found in what we call the Old Testament, and all 5 are to be found in the New Testament. That's a bit of a surprise for some Christians, but we're going to go through them carefully. I'm afraid not all Christians agree that there are 5. Some say there's only 1 covenant in the whole of Scripture. They call it the covenant of grace. Reformed theologians and Presbyterians believe in the covenant of grace, though that phrase never occurs in the Bible. But they have lumped them all together as the covenant of grace. There are those who believe there are 2 covenants in the Bible, the Old and the New, and most people tend to assume that, who have not been taught. And the number goes right up to 7, with theologians called dispensational theologians. But I believe there are 5 major covenants in the Bible, and that's what I'm going to expound now for you. But what is a covenant? It's a binding agreement between 2 parties with obligations on both sides. That's the simplest definition I can give. And that is very different from the most commonly experienced agreement between 2 parties, which we call a contract. And I want to spend a few moments telling you the difference between those 2 things. The Bible doesn't have any contracts in it. It tells us of a number of people who tried to get a contract with God and therefore get him under some obligation to them. But you can't do that. The reason is very simple. There's nothing you have that God needs. Therefore, you can't negotiate a contract with him. A contract is between 2 parties of equal power and equal resources who are in a position to negotiate between them. The commonest form of contract, in my experience, has been a building contract. My hobby is architecture, and I design church premises in my spare time. And I've designed quite a few by now. And usually, a contract with a builder is negotiable. I've got money, he's got skill and material and labor. So we can get together and decide on a contract which is a price that will be negotiated by both of us. And then the contract, when it's agreed, is signed and often sealed, and therefore it holds from then on. And if either party does not fulfill the terms of the contract, the other party is free from it. So in a building contract, the client agrees to pay the money each month, that the builder demands to go on building, and the builder promises to complete the building in such and such a time for such and such a total price. They have negotiated. They each have a strong ground which the other needs, and therefore a mutual agreement is eventually reached. Now, we are very familiar with contracts because most of life is made up of contracts in business and commerce. But even when you buy something, if you buy it on hire purchase, you are bound by a contract to repay the price of that object you've bought. And most furniture today in England is bought on hire purchase, and you agree to pay so much each month until it's all paid with interest. And that's a danger. But I'm not going to talk about money now. I've talked about that already in the conference we had just recently for market leaders. Let me now tell you what a covenant is. It's not between equal parties. It's between a stronger person and a weaker person. And the stronger person is in a position to dictate the terms of the covenant. And the other party has really little freedom except to accept the terms or reject them. But there must be no negotiation, no bargaining. There can't be. In the ancient world, the most frequent covenants were made by kings who had conquered another nation. And they then made a covenant to look after that nation on certain conditions. And the conquering king dictated the terms of the covenant. And the people he'd conquered had no choice except to say yes or no. And if they said no, they would become rebels. They would have to have a revolution to try and get rid of this new king. But the covenant was settled. Now then, I'm going to ask you a leading question. How many of you consider marriage is a covenant or a contract? I'm going to take a vote on it just to see the balance here. How many of you think marriage is a contract between two equal parties? No? Nobody? How many of you think marriage is a covenant? Now, if I was speaking to unbelievers today, they would have voted unanimously for a contract, because marriage is fast becoming nothing more than an agreed contract between a young man and a young woman. And now in my country, it's a contract between two men or two women. Recently in a church in England, in the same service, the minister dissolved a wedding between a couple in his church, and he then married the man to another woman in the congregation, and married the woman to another woman in the congregation, and did it all in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the service was televised. Unbelievable, isn't it? But it's coming here. The pressure of liberal egalitarianism is everywhere now. And so men and women are considered as equals. And therefore a marriage is an agreement between two equals. It's a contract. And if one stops loving the other, the contract falls to the ground. And you find a new partner, you get divorced and remarried, and you make a new contract. And that's happening on a wide scale. And the tragedy is churches are accepting divorcees and remarried people into their membership without any hesitation. It's the way in which we first let down our standards of sexual ethics. It happened in my country in the 1960s, and we lost our moral authority to speak on sexual ethics. It's no wonder that now the Church of England is being torn apart over gay marriage. Jesus said nothing about homosexuality or about abortion. From the rest of the Bible, we can come to a Christian opinion about both. But actually, Jesus said a great deal about divorce and remarriage. But the church ignored that in the 1960s in my country, and an egalitarian or equal concept of contract in marriage swept in. So you were right to say it's a covenant. God calls it a covenant. There was one man in the north of England I heard of who married a bad woman. He was a Christian, but she turned out to be a bad wife. And it wasn't long before she went on the streets as a prostitute. And her health began to suffer. She ran away from husband and children. And all his Christian friends said, you should get a divorce. You should find a decent Christian woman who'll be a good partner in your marriage. And he said, never speak to me like that about my wife. She's my wife, and I shall love her as long as there's breath in her body. And she died a few years later as the result of her life, probably of some sexually transmitted disease. And as she died, he was there with her, praying for her with his hands of love spread over her. That's covenant love. But if marriages break up and people are remarried, it's no more than a contract. So what in daily life do we know that helps us to understand what a covenant is? Well, there are one or two things. We have a system in England whereby if we give money to charity, we can reclaim the tax from the government for that gift. It's called gift aid now, but it used to be called covenanted giving. And if you agreed to promise to give a certain sum of money for 7 years to a recognized charity, the government would give all the tax back on top of it. And many churches relied on that for their running expenses. I'm telling churches now, don't rely on return tax. There'll come a day when that does not apply and governments refuse to do it and question whether a church is a charity. That has just begun in our country. And the charity commissioners, as they're called, are looking very carefully at charities claiming tax back. It's much harder to do now, to be registered as a charity. But there is one thing in our lives that is a straight covenant, a straight testament. And it's when you make what we call a last will and testament, leaving your money or property or anything to people who come after you. I hope you've made a will, because if you haven't, it creates an awful lot of trouble for your surviving relatives and raises many questions as to where your money or property finishes up. So make a will. And that is a covenant. It's freely entered into by one party who dictates the terms of the covenant to those who benefit, to those who are legatees, who get a legacy from your will. And I want you to notice one thing. That will is pretty useless until you die. It can only come into operation with your death. And then it becomes available to those you've left your money or property to. Now, That argument is in your New Testament. When Jesus made his last will and testament, the new covenant, it could not come into operation until he died. And it was his death that released the benefits of the new covenant. And you find that argument in the letter to the Hebrews. It's a very sound argument. So there's one example of something you do. You covenant to give so much money or bits of your property to certain people. And it can be an unconditional covenant or a conditional covenant. The one who makes the covenant decides the terms. There have been some unusual conditional wills. Some have said, you won't get my money until you're 21 years of age. A covenant that leaves money to a grandchild, for example. There have even been covenanted wills that say, if you change your surname to my surname, you can have my money, and thus continue the family name. So some covenants are conditional and some are unconditional, but they're all covenants because one party has made the terms and the other party can only say yes or no. You can refuse a legacy. Very few people do, but I knew one man who did. When I was at college, one of the other students was the leader of the Communist Party among the students. And he was the son of a very large and wealthy shoe manufacturer in England. And when the father died, he left the whole business to his son. And his son, being a communist, refused to become a capitalist and refused the legacy. And he was within his rights to do that. He was only able to say yes or no to the covenant. I think I've probably said enough to make the difference clear between covenant and contract. The people who've tried to make a contract with God are many. Jacob tried. When Jacob was running away from home, having deceived his elderly blind father and stolen the birthright from his brother Esau, he had a dream as he lay out in the open country and saw a ladder reaching heaven and angels ascending and descending on it. When he woke up, he said, God, if you will bring me back safely to my father's house, I will give you 1/10 of all that I possess. It was a promise of a tithe or 1/10. It was not the beginning of tithing. It was a voluntary thing that he said. It was his idea. But you see what he was doing? He was trying to get God into a contract. If you do this, I'll do that. And you can't bargain with God. And there came a day when he struggled with God and wrestled with God, and God took his leg out of joint. And he limped for the rest of his life. We often forget that. But the father of the nation of Israel was a cripple because he tried to make a bargain with God, tried to get God into a contract. There are people today who've been taught to tithe. I'll be telling you later that's not on for the Christian. We are not in that covenant of tithing. It's the Moses covenant. Nevertheless, they've been taught to think that if they give 1/10 to God, he'll bless their business and give back the money with interest. But that's a contract. You can't make a contract with God Almighty. You can accept one of his covenants, or you can refuse them all. But you can't get him into a bargain contract because he doesn't need anything you have. One of my favorite texts is in Psalm 50. It says, where God says this, "If I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you." Lovely text to preach on. And he goes on to say, "The cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. All the silver and the gold is mine." So God won't let himself get into a contract. You try as hard as you can. You'll never get God in your debt. We had a lovely little man in our church who said to me once, "David," he said, "I was in the Second World War as a soldier, and in the thick of one dreadful battle, my mates were dying either side of me, and I said to the Lord, 'Lord, if you will get me safely back to my family and back home, I'll go to church every Sunday for the rest of my life.'" That was his negotiated contract with God. He thought it up very carefully, and he thought God will respond to that. And then this man confessed to me that as soon as he got back home, he didn't go to church, and he didn't keep his part of the contract. But God was not held to that contract either. God never signed it. And then this dear man said to me, "Could I have a second bite of the cherry?" I knew what he meant. I said, "You can, but not on your terms. You can have a covenant relationship with God now, but it will never be on your terms." And he became a lovely Christian man. Well, now we've said enough. Now let me come to the point. Number one, we have a covenant-making God. And that is the most astonishing thing in the Bible. That God, who made the entire universe, who is great, who is powerful, beyond our imagining, would make a covenant with human beings. We tiny creatures on this little bit of stellar dust we call the earth, that he, the creator of everything, should make a covenant with us. And yet that is the story of the Bible and the covenants he made. And he even has taken human names as his own name. That should astonish us. He is called to this day the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and those were the three men with whom he made a covenant. He married them and made promises to them. For behind every covenant there are solemn promises to do something for the other. And those promises are sealed in some way. All covenants are sealed. They contain promises which begin, "I will, I will." And if you go through your Bible and underline, as I have done in mine, the two words, "I will," you will be absolutely astonished. Thousands of times God says, "I will," and every one is a promise. And God cannot break a promise. He keeps his word. And so to each person with whom he made a covenant, he said, "I will," and sealed the promise in a number of different ways. One way of sealing a promise is blood. When in some gypsy weddings, when the wedding takes place, they cut the palm of the bridegroom with a knife and the palm of the bride with a knife, and they bind their hands together so that the blood mixes. And it's said to be a covenant in blood. A number of the covenants of the Bible were sealed with blood, with sacrifice. Not just the new covenant, but one of the old covenants with Abraham was sealed with a sacrifice. And Abraham took an animal and cut it into two halves and separated them. And he walked through the two halves, so did God. And they sealed that covenant in blood, in a sacrifice. Sometimes a covenant is sealed with an oath. That's more than a promise. An oath is actually swearing by some power greater than yourself, a power that will kill you if you don't keep the bond. And that's why people swear by heaven and by God. But God has a problem. There is no power greater than God by whom he can swear. So he swears by himself. And you'll find a number of the covenants, God swears, by myself I have sworn. And I suppose what he's really meaning, if I don't keep my promise, I'll commit suicide. He's swearing by himself that he will keep. When you go into a court in England anyway, you're given a Bible and you have to say these words: I swear by Almighty God that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And what you're doing is you're calling God to kill you if you don't tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's a very solemn oath. But today, people don't believe in God, so it's become almost a formality to swear on the Bible in court. Most people who do don't even realize the meaning of it. It's just become an empty ritual. But it's actually very serious. So God is a covenant-making God. Why should he even consider doing such a thing, binding himself to human beings? The answer is really very simple. We've got to go right back to the beginning and ask why God created human beings at all. And the answer I'm going to give you is as simple as I can make it. He already had one son whom he so enjoyed that he wanted a bigger family. Nothing could be simpler. He wanted more sons and daughters than he already had. Few earthly parents are content with one child. It's not really quite a family yet. And so they go on to have more children. And then it becomes a true family. That was why God created you and me, that we might search for God and find him and become part of his family on earth. And one of the promises that God makes when he makes a covenant with a human being is a phrase that runs right through the Bible from beginning to end. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they're almost the last words in your Bible. They run right through again. God wants a family, but he wants a family on his terms, a family on his covenant. And that's how he's building up a family. And we can't have a relationship with God on any basis but a covenant which he has made with us. The next thing I want to say is this: we have a covenant-making God, and we have a covenant-keeping God. When he says, I will, he means it, and he never goes back on it. He keeps his promises. He's reliable. That's why we sang this song early this morning, Great is thy faithfulness. His reliability, his utter stability, incorruptible. God swears by himself, and even if we, excuse me, I knew that was coming, even if we are unfaithful to the covenant, he remains faithful to it. He keeps his side of it. Amazingly. that he never breaks it. Well, the word that the Bible uses in Hebrew in the Old Testament for that faithful love of his is chesed, C-H-E-S-E-D. It's usually translated in our Bibles as loving kindness. But it's more than that. We need the word loyal in there somewhere. It's his loyal love, and it's kept within his covenants. It's not a general love. It's not a love for the whole world. It's a covenant love for those he has promised something to, people within a covenant. His loving kindness is confined to them. And it's a loyal love. It's a love that keeps marriage promises. And he has married Israel. And he treats Israel as his wife. He calls the nation his wife. And when she goes after other gods, he calls her an adulteress. And when she goes more and more after them, he calls her a prostitute. The whole marriage thing is the relationship between God and Israel. And therefore, time and again, their sin is seen as one of unfaithfulness to a marriage covenant. So we have a covenant-keeping God, and that's his loyal, loving kindness. Now then, I hope you've each been given a sheet of paper as you came in. Were you? Can you turn to the side of the sheet that is a chart? That's going to take us the rest of this morning. We call the 5 covenants that he made with humans by the name of the main human being with whom he made the covenant. So down your left-hand column, you have those names. We refer to the Noahic covenant because it was made with Noah. And then the Abrahamic covenant. Then the Mosaic covenant. Then the Davidic covenant. And finally, what I've called the Messianic covenant, made with Jesus Christ, who came to be the Messiah of Israel. So that explains the left column down. Now let me explain the top column across. 6 questions which we're going to ask of each covenant, because each covenant was quite different. They were different in the parties with whom they were made, and the places where they were made. Noah's covenant was not just made with Noah, but through him with the entire human race. And that was made on Mount Ararat when the ark came to rest after the flood. The second question we ask is, what was offered by way of a promise? What God said, I will do. I'm sorry, I haven't got one myself. Isn't that terrible? So I hope I'm right. Is that the second column? Good. The third question is, what provisos were made? Were there any conditions that God imposed with that covenant? What were the terms of the covenant? And we need to ask that about each of them. Was it an unconditional covenant with no proviso, or a conditional one? Then we ask about the penalties. If human beings failed to keep their part of the covenant, what would happen to them? Then we look at the period. How long was this covenant made to last? And finally, we ask the all-important question of purpose. Why did God make that particular covenant? Because they're all different, and therefore each was for a different purpose. And as we go through them, we'll see the plan of redemption unfold. We'll actually see the purpose of the whole Bible. And that's why I'm starting with this subject for you. I want to lay a firm foundation in the whole Bible for your faith. Well, now let's start, and let's start with the Noah covenant. And we'll have to just paint the background a little. Noah was the only righteous man in his generation. And for that reason, God saved that man and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people, out of a whole generation. What had gone wrong? Things had got to such a pitch that we have the saddest verse in the whole Bible. God regretted that he had made man. I've sat in children's courts and heard parents say, we wish we'd never had children. What a sad statement for a parent. And they've said that about very young children, who even by 8 and 9 have turned out to be pretty bad children. I think that reflects on the parents as much as anybody, because up to the age of responsibility, God holds parents responsible for their children and their behavior. Nevertheless, what had happened in the days of Noah was a particularly ugly situation whereby angels had sexual intercourse with human women. We're told that in Genesis 6. You'd think that was impossible, wouldn't you? In God's creation, angels are his supreme creation. They are more intelligent, more beautiful, more powerful than we are. They are the peak of God's creation. We are only second in God's creation. The evolutionist thinks we're the top of evolution, but there are angels above. And then come the humans, and then come the animals. And there are profound differences between angels and humans and animals. Such differences that God has forbidden sex between them. Alas, Hollywood is now getting interested in a thing that was common in the Roman world when the New Testament was written: sex between men and animals. And there are statues have been uncovered of the Roman practices of sex with goats. It's nauseating. But then sex between angels and human beings is just as wrong. We know the details from another writing outside the Bible. It's called the Book of Enoch. There were 200 angels studied the daughters of men that they were fair and came down and had sex with them. And that union produced something which in Hebrew is called Nephilim. I don't know what they were. They were a strange hybrid that God never intended. Some Bibles translate that giants, but that's not we don't know what that word actually means, but it's a weird hybrid that was on the earth in those days. It's not there now, thank God, it's died out. But this was a horrid thing. And it was that marked the beginning of human interest in occultism. because the angels brought their superior knowledge with them, and it became occultism. If you have anything to do with the occult, get rid of it quickly. You're really enjoying the fruit of that illicit union. Now, the result of this was violence filled the whole earth. Kinky sex leads to violence. If you're treating another person as an object of your desire, it will not be long before you become violent. Sex and violence, kinky sex, perverted sex, and violence go together. And you rarely have one without the other. And violence filled the earth in Noah's day. It became an unsafe place for everybody. And indeed, there is one statement that every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. There's a total statement of depravity and decadence that was the result of this illicit union. Now God regretted that he'd made man. Some people say, well, God knew everything. Are you sure about that? Did he know it was going to happen? He knew it could. But when it did, he was sorry that he'd ever started it all. I think that's tragic. I could weep for God, couldn't you? What a disappointment. And that's the background of the covenant with Noah. And you need the background to realize what a wonderful thing it was that when Noah got safe, after building a huge boat in the middle of land, and people said, you're crazy. You'll never get the boat as far as the sea. And Noah said, well, the sea will come to this. This boat will float. Can you just imagine the mockery of the people around? They must have made life intolerable for Noah. But he saved the other 7 people, and they came out of the ark to start again. And then God made a covenant with them. And the covenant was very simple. I'll never do that again, says God. Not as long as the earth remains. I'll never do that again. And he hasn't. He's kept his promise. People are impatient with God. They want him to get on and deal with evil in the world. And sometimes people say to me, if only God would destroy all the wicked people in the world, the rest of us could live a safe and happy life. And there's something wrong with that argument. Did you spot it? They are talking as if they would survive, as if they're not wicked, as if they have not contributed to this crazy world. If God destroyed everybody who had made this world a worse place for others, you wouldn't have a preacher this morning, and I would have no one to teach. You wouldn't even be here. Thank God that he doesn't deal with bad people immediately. He has got a day in his diary when he will. He's already decided that. But thank God for his patience, that he's waited centuries before doing that, because he's still hoping that his other covenants will have effect. But we haven't come to those yet. The covenant with Noah was that he would keep the seasons going while the earth was still hurtling through space. And he has kept that promise. Seed time and harvest shall not fail. Do you know that there is enough food in the world every year for everyone in it to have enough to eat. I have the authority of the United Nations Food Office to tell you that. I've spoken to an official in that organization. There is enough food in the world for everybody, yet 1/3 goes to bed hungry and another third goes to bed starving. Whose fault is it? People blame God for that. It's not God's fault at all. The other third of the world is struggling with obesity and overeating and is not sharing the food evenly among the population, which is on an exponential curve of growth. And it's getting progressively worse. The gap between rich and poor is steadily increasing on a world scale. And that's not God's fault. He is still producing enough food every year for the people in our world. And the food figures back that up. But we will not share it properly. That's the simple fact. It's almost as if an earthly father put a padlock on the deep freeze and then said, God, my children are starving. It's crazy, isn't it? That's what we're doing. We're keeping the food for a few people. Some people have too much, while many have too little. He's kept his covenant. He's still keeping it. He's never canceled this one. He says, while the earth remains, so we know the period. Now I've skipped something. What did he expect of us in response to that? The two things, of course, we need for food are light and moisture, sun and rain. And the amazing thing here is that God says, when I send you the moisture and the light together, by which you will grow all your food, there'll be a rainbow in the sky. And that's my kind of wedding ring that ties me to the human race. But he said, that's not a reminder to you, it'll be a reminder to me to keep that covenant. So when you see a rainbow, praise God that he's reminding himself to keep us fed. It therefore is a covenant of survival. And I've called it that on your paper. A covenant of survival. But what does he expect of us in return for his promise to keep life alive? Well, there are two things. He said the first thing is that you must keep the sacredness of life. And you do that by capital punishment for the murderer. That's based purely on the sacredness of life. It certainly doesn't cure the murderer, and it's not statistically a deterrent to other murderers. The only reason for capital punishment is retribution. And God's point is that a murderer has actually destroyed the image of God. And that's the crime of sacrilege. You've touched something sacred. And that's a very serious crime and must be punished by taking the murderer's life. But my country abolished capital punishment in the 60s. And when it did, I said to my wife that we've lost the sacredness of human life. And I said the next thing will be abortion, which followed a few years later. And the thing after that will be euthanasia. And that's now the talk in Europe. And it's coming, they're already discussing it officially in my country. Once you lose the sacredness of human life made in the image of God, then anything can happen. And soon we'll say to Granny, we're going to put you down like we put an old dog down that's useless. And it will not be a safe society for elderly people. And they will wonder how soon their relatives will get rid of them. That's coming. It's on the way already. But it started with the abolition of capital punishment. I understand you have still kept capital punishment here in Singapore. It should be kept for murder, for the destruction of the image of God. That's human life. But he also has expected us to treat animal life with respect. And part of this covenant was that man can now eat meat. Up till then, people were vegetarian. They lived on fruit and plants. Now God says you can eat meat, but you must be very careful not to eat meat with life in it. And in the thinking of the Bible, life is blood. The blood is the life of a body. As long as there's blood circulating around it, there's life. And so God said, the way you kill an animal is going to be very important. Drain the blood. It's a warning against eating live flesh. And that is an offense to God. Just as it's an offense to God to let a murderer live, it's an offense to God to eat an animal with life in it. That's the meaning behind it. And so those were the two things. But he didn't make them conditions. And therefore there is a widespread ignorance, ignoring these two requirements. And yet God has not cancelled the covenant because they weren't conditions. They were expectations. And God no doubt thought that if I do all that for the human race will be grateful enough to do those two things for me. The purpose of all this was God's bigger family, which he could never have if the human race died. And so he said, I will preserve the human race so that I will be able to get a family out of it, so that I will have some choice of my sons and daughters. And that covenant has clearly continued till this morning. When I saw the sun rise this morning, I remembered the Noahic covenant, and thank God for it. Let's move on. The second covenant that the Bible talks about is the Abrahamic covenant. And it was made with Abraham. It was made with his son, Isaac, and his grandson, Jacob, with the three of them. And the exact terms of the covenant were repeated 3 times in the book of Genesis. They were not repeated to Joseph. God didn't make a covenant with Joseph. He made it with the 3 generations called the fathers, the patriarchs of the nation of Israel. So it was not, strictly speaking, just with Abraham, but it was with his son, his grandson, and all descendants from them. Now notice that the first covenant we talked about is international. It affects the whole world, all nations. The second covenant is both national and international. It is a covenant of selection First was a covenant of survival for the whole world. Second was a selection of one nation in the world to bless all the others. And that's God's method. My wife and I had 3 children. One is now in heaven with the Lord, but 2 are still with us. And when they were little, I used to buy, every Saturday morning, I used to buy them candies or sweets or chocolate or something nice. And I had a choice. I could either buy 1 bag of sweets and give it to one of the 3 of them and say, share that with the other 2. Or I could give them each a bar of chocolate or whatever, separately. When I did it the first way, we didn't have peace in the house. When I did it the second way, we did. So should I have always given them each separately? It's when you give them to one to share with the others, the dispute arises. You got more than I have. It's not fair. And so the old strife that arises between men and women arises already with children. It's what the philosophers call the scandal of particularity. That God, to bless the world, should choose one nation. And the world doesn't think that's fair. It means that if you want to know God and you want to know the blessings of God, you've got to find the Jews. And you will owe a debt to them and to no other nation. Why didn't God send a message of salvation through an American Messiah to America, a Russian Messiah to Russia, a Singaporean Messiah to Singapore? Why not do it that way? Wouldn't that have been better? No. God's method is always to select one nation and through that nation to bless all the others. And he has stuck to that method. And of all nations he could have chosen, he chose the Jewish nation. And he chose them quite deliberately because they were nothing when he chose them. They were a bunch of slaves who didn't have any time of their own, any money of their own. They were slaves to the Egyptians. They were nobodies. They had no power. They had no name for themselves. They had nothing. And God chose them because he could make them into something. God is always choosing nobodies and making them into somebodies. That's his method. But he uses some of his creatures to bless the others. And both sides are in the covenant with Abraham. For himself, he promised 2 things, seed and land. He promised descendants. Now that was quite a thing to do to an old man. And he said, your descendants will be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. You ever tried to count them? With the naked eye, you can see 6,000 stars. With a telescope, it just becomes a blaze of light. What a promise. Your descendants will be as many as that. And then he said, and I promise you a land where they can live forever. And in those covenant promises, God actually drew the map of the promised land to his people. Just to add a side note to that, only half the Jews are back in the promised land, and they've only got just over a quarter of the promised land so far. So don't fall for the idea that the Jews are back in the land and that they've got the land back. They haven't. But God is well on the way to doing it. He began to do it in 1875. And so far he's got half the Jews back. And since anti-Semitism is spreading in the Western world rapidly. I don't know how long it'll be before he gets the rest back, but he's determined to get them back, all of them, and give them back all the land he promised to them. And somehow, through political events, he will achieve that. But that's by the way. Let's go back to this important covenant. He promised that to Abraham, but he also promised that through you and your descendants, every family on earth will be blessed. That was his purpose in selecting the Jews. That was the purpose of the covenant, that he would have what he called a holy nation, a nation of priests who would mediate God to the whole world, introduce them to God. And so he made that covenant, made those promises. The proviso, it was virtually unconditional, except for one thing. Every male descendant had to be circumcised, an operation on the organ of reproduction, which would remind him that he was a covenant receiver of the land. I shocked some Jews in Jerusalem by saying that every Jew carries the title deeds of the promised land inside his trousers. They knew what I meant immediately. That was the only requirement of this covenant. And if a male descendant refused to be circumcised for one reason or another, he was to be cut off from the people of God. He was out. And so you'll find every male Jew today is very careful to be circumcised. And I'm even going to dare to tell you a joke about that, just to lighten proceedings. There was a man studied all the religions of the world to decide which would suit him best. And after studying them all, he settled on Judaism. And he went to a local rabbi and said, I want to be a Jew. I believe that's the best religion for me. And the rabbi took him through the doctrines and the duties of the whole thing and said, do you accept all these? He said, yes, I do. Well, said the rabbi, I'm afraid there's a small surgical operation that you'll have to undergo, and then you can be a Jew. And he said immediately, he said to the rabbi, is it very painful? And the rabbi said, well, I can't answer that because I don't remember. I was only 8 days when I had it done. He said, mind you, I do remember one thing. I couldn't walk for a whole year afterwards. No laughter. Go and ask someone else. But every Jewish male has to have that surgical operation. And if any grown male wants to become Jewish, he'll have to have it. But literally, it entitles you to a share in the promised land. But that's the national side of the promise. The international is that through you, everyone will be blessed, everyone else. But, and this is a big but, everyone who blesses your descendants will be blessed. But everyone who curses your descendants will be cursed by God. And history underlines that part of the covenant. Where are the Assyrians today? Nowhere. Where are the Babylonians? Where are the Egyptians? Egypt's full of Arabs, not Egyptians. Where are the Romans? Where are the Greeks? All these empires which have oppressed the Jewish nation have disappeared. And Israel's back on the map again. That's a staggering fact. And it's still through the Jews that we get saved. Jesus says salvation is of the Jews. And we've got to go to the Jewish scriptures, to a Jewish Messiah, to find salvation. And yet Gentiles invariably forget their debt to the Jewish people. We owe our salvation to the Jews. The first apostles were all Jews. The first church was all Jewish. Your Bible in your hand was written by 39 Jews plus one Gentile. You owe it to the Jewish people. And we have been blessed, I have been blessed by the Jews. Blessed in ordinary ways. Did you use a telephone today? Or will do? You owe that to the Jew. Did you fly in a plane here? It was a Jew invented flight. Did you eat a tomato for breakfast? It was a Jew discovered tomatoes were edible. Did you ever go to a dentist and have an injection before they drilled your teeth? You owe that to a Jewish dentist. I hope you've never had a sexual transmitted disease, but if you had, and the doctors cured you, it was with a drug that was invented by a Jew. Before the war, in Germany, Jews controlled the banks, the theaters, so much. The universities, quarter of the Jewish professors were Jewish. And there was Hitler trying to say the Germans were a superior race. Well, the Jews were a straight denial of that, so he had to get rid of them. Though he did keep one of them as his cook for the whole period of the war, because he was the best chef. Amazing, isn't it? The Jews have played a huge part in your daily life without you knowing. They are only 1% of the world's population, but they've provided 12% of the world's scientists. And we've all benefited from their discoveries. And they are now way out ahead in technology, believe me. I hope you never need to have your blood irrigated. I'm trying to think of the correct term where you need to have a regular, every 2 or 3 days, change of blood and have it washed. What's the word I'm wanting? You know what I mean, don't you? Well, sorry? Can't hear it properly, but the rest of you could. So you have to go to hospital and twice a week and be geared up to a huge machine which will change your blood and wash it and put it back in. And it's a real trial to those who have to do that. Do you know the Jews have invented a machine that's the size of a briefcase, which you can hook on to a hotel cold tap that will cleanse your blood. And all you need to do is carry around a briefcase. And you're free of hospitals. You're free to have your blood changed. I found, to my dismay, that the British government won't accept it for health and safety reasons, they say, while Jews are freely traveling around the world with their little dialysis, that's the word I'm wanting, little dialysis machine. They are just so ingenious. They're inventing things that the world is snapping up within the sphere of technology. The world's armed forces are snatching up their inventions, technology in warfare, clones, no, drones is what I'm meaning, those planes that are quite independent of human crews that can do everything a bomber did before. All that we owe to the Jew. And the world doesn't acknowledge its debt. The top musicians in the world are Jews, the top architects. The man who designed Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, was called Nehemiah. And he built the walls of the capital of Brazil. We all are in debt to the Jew, but above all, Christians are in debt to the Jew. They have shared with the world so much, and we could not even find God without the Jew. All that is the national and international covenant with Abraham. And the purpose was that God would have a nation on earth living at the center of the world. If you take all the land masses of the world and try and find the point at which they all balance, your pin will be through the city of Jerusalem. The whole world balances on that point. It's the center of the world. The road from Asia to Africa crosses the road from Europe to Arabia at a little hill in the middle of a flat plain called Megiddo. And the hill of Megiddo in Hebrew is Har-Mageddon. And there's a little village on the side of the mountain overlooking that crossroads of the world, and it's called Nazareth. And if you've been there, you know that Jesus as a boy could lie on the top of the hill and watch the world go by. It was like an airport lounge, that you could just see so many nations crossing that crossroads. No wonder it was called Galilee of the Nations. Jerusalem was a bit further south, up in the mountains by itself. The only capital in the world that wasn't on a river or a port, but was the city of God, a unique city. You don't even see it as you approach it. It nestles in a saucer on the top of the mountains. And it's an amazing city to see, the most interesting ever to visit. But I mustn't get on to that. That then is the Abrahamic covenant. What were the penalties for it? There weren't any. It was an unconditional covenant, except for the matter of circumcision, for the national side of it. For the rest, it was unconditional. And the purpose of it was very clear, that God should have an entry into the human race, that God should be able to reach everybody through this nation. And he has done. We are an international gathering this morning, and we're here because of the Jew called Jesus. We're here because of their history and their story, which they wrote down for us. And this is the most amazing thing. What nation in the world has recorded for posterity all its failures? Go to Egypt and you'll see the history of Egypt in hieroglyphics carved in stone, and every bit of it is about their victory, their triumph over other nations. Everything is there to build up the nation. And you don't celebrate National Day on Friday, was it? To celebrate your failures? It's your successes you celebrated. Every nation does that, except Israel. And they faithfully recorded everything they did wrong. Isn't that amazing? But they did it so that you would learn from their mistakes. I've got 5 minutes more, so let's just begin to look at the next. The Mosaic covenant came 350 years later. than the Abrahamic, but you'd be amazed how many people get them confused, especially when they talk about the Old Covenant. The Abrahamic covenant is not old. It is not obsolete, but the Mosaic is. It was made only until Jesus Christ came. We're told that clearly in Galatians. It is an old covenant. It's obsolete now. It's past its sell-by date. But I'll show you at the beginning of the next talk how many churches are imposing this old covenant on their people. And it's a tragic mistake. This covenant was national and only national, and was made for the security of Israel in the land which God had promised them. The Mosaic covenant is not for us. We can learn from it, and that's why it's in the Bible. It's good to study it and see how he dealt with his chosen people. But it's a national covenant for one nation. In the Abrahamic covenant, they became the owners of the promised land. The Mosaic covenant gave them the conditions of occupying it. They will own it as long as it's there, and they will occupy it as long as they keep the Mosaic covenant. But it's for them, including the 10 Commandments, though I've seen them painted up on church walls. In fact, the first church of which I was pastor, I was horrified when I saw that behind the pulpit, on the wall behind, in an archway, in dark brown chocolate color, Gothic printing, the 10 Commandments. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to preach in front of that. And it wasn't long before I got a paintbrush and painted it out. Are you shocked? I'm not going to preach the Old Covenant. I will preach every bit of it that's repeated in the New Covenant, and 9 out of the 10 Commandments are repeated in the New. 1 is not. And I'm not going to impose that on Christians because it's part of the 10 Commandments.
Dust started to settle. I find fragments of a time when our hearts beat in rhythm like a metronome so gentle. The echoes of laughter still linger in the air as I trace the fading lines of our story. In this symphony of moments, I hear the melody of a love once glorious and gory. Oh, the rhythm of our hearts, a song so bittersweet. A dance of passion and pain where the past and present meet. In the silence, I hear your voice calling out to me. An instrumental intro to a love that's yet to fully set me free. In the canvas of my mind, I paint the memories in art pop hues. Indie shades of love where the colors of our souls intertwine subdued. Through the lens of time, I see the beauty in the chaos that we've been. A masterpiece of love, a dance of shadows where the light begins to dim. Oh, the rhythm of our hearts, a song so bittersweet. A dance of passion and pain where the past and present meet. In the silence, I hear your voice calling out to me. An instrumental intro to a love that's yet to fully set me free. In the canvas of my mind, I paint the memories in art pop hues. Indie shades of love, indie shades of love, where the colors of our souls intertwine subdued. Subdued. Through the lens of time, I see the beauty in the chaos that we've been. A masterpiece of love, a dance of shadows where the light begins to dim. Oh, the rhythm of our hearts, a song so bittersweet. A dance of passion and pain, where the past and present meet. In the silence I hear your voice calling out to me, an instrumental intro to a love that's yet to fully set me free. In the quiet corners of my memories where the dust has started to settle, I find fragments of a time when our hearts beat in rhythm, like a metronome so gentle. The echoes of laughter still linger in the air as I trace the fading lines of our story. In this symphony of moments, I hear the melody of a love once glorious and gory. In the quiet corners of my memories, where the dust has started to settle, I find fragments of a time when our hearts beat in rhythm, like a metronome so gentle. The echoes of laughter still